Thank you for all your presentations. I have a question. Would fossils be able to form in like a volcano type eruption?
Possibly, although today I haven't really seen any reports of fossils being formed that way. There is in north here in Washington State, there's a huge, in fact, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, there's a huge area covered up by basalt. That's a volcanic flow. And there's one place that I've been to in Washington where you climb up a slope on the, against this cliff, and you come up to where you can look into a hole in the rock. You can take a flashlight and look around in there and you realize that was a rhinoceros. It was buried in the lava flow, and then the animal rotted away and the bones are left. Now there's just a hole. So occasionally it does happen. But during a time like Mount St. Helens, it seemed like you should have preserved fossils, but I haven't seen reports of that happening. And the problem here is that we don't really know what it takes to make a fossil. I mean, you have to bury it fast, but why does it get preserved still? At last fall at geology meetings, there were several papers where people tried to experimentally determine that. They would take creatures' bodies and bury them in the dirt. Then they would percolate water down through it with various minerals, chemicals, to try to see what it would take to make a fossil. None of it worked. All those things were gone in a week or two. And so we really don't know what it takes to make a fossil.
Well, mine was kind of similar to Cheryl's. I was thinking about what happened in Pompeii. Mm-hmm. And how bodies were preserved, mm-hmm. and how did that happen? So
yeah.
Were they preserved instantly then? When that
No, actually in Pompeii you don't have the bodies. What you have is the mold.
The mold.
So the ash and everything came in, covered them, and it firmed up enough so that as the bodies rotted away, you now have the mold, but you don't have the bodies.
Okay, then my one other thing was, what happened to all the people from the flood? Mm-hmm. Is that part of the lost part? Because, you were seeing animals from that era, but we're assuming there were maybe millions of people, or...
Could have been.
Mm-hmm. And what happened? How come we don't see any humans mm-hmm. in those layers?
Well, I hope you'll answer it, and that will help us, because none of us know. I mean, we can think of ideas, but we obviously don't know. One, maybe the people were more intelligent, and they survived long enough to just rot on the surface.
Right.
And I've at least often kind of thought of how the flood starts, and all of a sudden the ark is floating and the people are taken away. Well, we don't know that. I mean, the ark was built up on the ground. It might have been some months before the flood water actually got up that high. I mean, it could be. And so the people were floating off. It could be that the people were living in a part of the earth where the fossils weren't forming at that time. Now that seems like, it seemed far out, but there is evidence that there were continents that had disappeared. Now that may seem, again, pretty far out. But keep in mind one thing. We have this stack of rocks, the oldest ones to the youngest ones, and our ocean floors that we have now are no older than about halfway down through that. So in the first half of that sequence, what was there where the oceans are now? We don't know. Nobody knows. And there could have well have been continents that are gone. And was that where the people were living? Well, that's just a wild idea. We don't know. But something was very unique happening.
Then one last one, which I think you kind of already answered, was can we make fossils today under certain conditions, like they do synthetic diamonds mm-hmm. and that type of thing?
Some things, yes. They can make coal in a short time, a few months. It doesn't take millions of years. You just have the right condition, and you make coal. Oil they can make. Certain kinds of fossils that are encased in silica, you can make in a short time. But for most fossils, no, we can't.
Mine's kind of a question, and Obviously, when you came here, you went across the Umpqua River, correct?
I guess so.
Okay. We lived just about 12 miles down the river and about halfway in between. My question is at one time, the Umpqua River now is way down low. And at one time I was walking the rim rocks, probably a good 300 feet above the river elevation. And here was these little fossils in the rim rocks, mostly little snails, what you see in the river and stuff, and your little periwinkles. So my question is, how long did that river, or at the flood time, had to stay there for those fossils to accumulate there in the rocks?
Okay, think of the bigger sequence of things that's happening. The flood makes all these layers of rock. And then as the flood is kind of settling down and winding down, then you have other smaller things happening that begin to erode the landscape. Rivers start to cut their way down into rocks. That cuts the Grand Canyon, and some areas get pushed up, and the rivers cut down through it. And so since the flood, I mean, you got several thousand years for all these things to happen. And so your river probably was up at a higher level at one point, and then it is cut down since then.
What that almost tells me, at one time, this here, even this elevation here, we were probably underwater for quite some time.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, yeah.
Yeah.
I understand fossil formation to a point, and you've probably already answered this, but I'd like to ask again, why do you find more fossils in some parts of the Earth than the other parts of the Earth? Or at least that's what it seems like to me. And if so, why is that?
That's a good question. Maybe you can answer it for me. No, you're right. In some rock formations you find almost none. Other rock formations you find just a lot. I mean, thousands. You know, if one studies those in detail, you can get ideas of why this is true. But we can't give just a general answer. Like, I studied fossil turtles in Wyoming, and you have all these rock layers, and there are sort of mud and sand and other materials, and periodically you have a limestone. Limestone is a chemical that forms in water. And right above each of these limestones you have untold thousands of turtles. So there's turtles here, then farther up there's more turtles, and more turtles. Okay, in that case, we can understand why this happened, because the limestone means there was water. That area was covered with water for a while. The turtles were in the water, and this is after the flood, I'm quite sure. And then you have a volcanic eruption up in northern Wyoming in the Yellowstone area. And so all that ash comes and it kills off the turtles and buries them. And so then more of that makes more and more sediment. Finally, the eruption stops, and there's more water and limestone, and then more turtles. And so these are mass mortalities of turtles in different layers. So in some cases like that, we can understand why it is. Other cases, it's harder to know why it's that way.
An American author, I can't remember the name of the book, but her name was Stacy Schiff, who wrote a biography of Ben Franklin in Paris. And she tells about one point, of course, he was interested in nature and scientists, and he heard a report that some workmen had been working on the native limestone there and had found a cavity in it and had pulled some live frogs out of it. So he rushed to the scene and asked if it was true, and they said yes. And he said, well, how do you know that they didn't get in there through a crack? And they described it, and that they had been encased in solid rock. And so he did the standard Franklin thing. He got 2 or 3 of them, and he doused them with wine to see how they'd behave, and they eventually died, of course. But that's Cretaceous limestone. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to talk to us about anything about living fossils or organisms that have been encased in some of these lower levels, and what your interpretation or understanding of those might be.
Well, I would have to ask Ben Franklin. I'm with him. Somehow I think they got in there through cracks. I don't know of any really well-established cases of living things coming out of rock. Now, there are exceptions. The exception is bacteria. There's been a lot of study of bacteria. There are live bacteria and algae living a mile down in granite. Explain that. You know, it seems like the bacteria are part of the rock cycle. They etch their way with acids through the rocks, and they do different things. They probably are involved in making oil, and so maybe God made bacteria to do that. But complex creatures, you know, I don't know of any that actually are like that.
I think that you answered your own question about why the more mobile animals are higher. Like anybody, when you're mobile and the water's coming up, you don't want to get your feet wet.
Right.
And you're going to move away from it. So naturally, the more mobile animals are going to be higher up and farther away.
Yeah, sure.
And hopefully, at the time of the ark, that would have been people.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think so.
Well, Dr. Brand, you have really put on quite a show here for us. You've led us through so much information, and we are so thankful. It's really impossible to put into words, and so I have bought a small little token of our appreciation. This is a book that I found about roadside geology of Oregon.
Oh, yeah, that's
And it's
interesting.
basically a tourist guide to different geological places here in Oregon. And I thought maybe it could be of some use just to help you know what's present here on a
Well, I
small
appreciate
scale
it.
basis.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Yeah,
you're very
I don't have that book.